And he looks at me and he says, well, I have one question. I'm a Mormon and you are not. You're an evangelical. Am I going to hell? I work at Faith Life, Logos. I'm a biblical scholar by training. And one of the things that biblical scholars do every year is we go to our version of a geek fest. That is the annual meetings in November for biblical studies, theology, all that sort of thing. And one year, I think it's probably less than 10 years ago, I went with the specific intention of meeting somebody. And this somebody was somebody I met online. I got an email one day that said, hey, you need to go over to this forum here on the internet because your view of Psalm 82, there's this guy in there defending it and he's taking a beating. People are really after him. So okay, I'll go look. So I went and looked. And sure enough, this guy's trying to defend, again, what I think is pretty obviously the correct way to look at the passage. And so I threw something in there and said, hey, ease up on this guy, he's doing okay, lighten up, essentially. And the next day I got an email from the guy taking the beating. And it turned out he was a professor at Brigham Young University. He was a Mormon. And we began a correspondence. And in the course of our correspondence, he let it be known that, every year I go to the annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society. And I'm like, why? You're what are you doing there? And he said to me, he goes, we depend on you guys. He goes, those of us over in Mormon land who care about biblical studies, we really look for the evangelical scholars to produce things that we can learn from. Because, we're not so much into that. We do other things here. And I said, well, that's fascinating. I said, as a matter of fact, this year, this November, I'm going to be reading a paper critiquing Mormonism's understanding of Psalm 82, because I don't agree with it. And he said, I'm going to be there. And sure enough, he came. He came, listened to the paper, and had real nice things to say, and he wound up asking to publish it. So that alone was kind of interesting. But we went to lunch afterwards, and so there we are. We get our lunch, we go find a table, we sit down, and he looks at me and he says, well, I have one question. I'm a Mormon, and you are not. You're an evangelical. Am I going to hell? Bon appetit. Just a nice way to begin your lunch there. Here's number 2. Again, and these things are related, even though they don't seem like it on the surface. I got an email. This was probably a month ago. And I occasionally get emails of people in theological distress. And it went like this. I'm not going to use his name, but Dear Mike, will you consider covering divorce and remarriage in your podcast? I am in torment over it. I've heard so many different views, all of which quote numerous verses, and now I'm not sure if I will lose my salvation or not if I get remarried. My ex-wife filed for divorce, not me. I never wanted it. My particular issue is that the likes of, and then we insert famous preacher names, would say that if I choose to remarry, I will become an adulterer since it is a present continuous relationship. And therefore, I will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. There are people who have divorced their second spouse because they felt convicted they were adulterers. And the question really is, can I lose my salvation by getting remarried because I'm choosing to become an adulterer? Now that's obviously a serious email. Now back at our academic conference, I'm sitting there with my fork in my hand, and this guy says, I'm a Mormon, and you're not. And, you're an evangelical, so am I going to hell? And I looked at him and I said, I'm going to answer that question the same way I would answer it if I was looking at a Jehovah's Witness, a Catholic, a fundamental Baptist, a Lutheran. I don't care, fill in the blank. I don't care what your tradition is. I don't care what you believe about other things. It doesn't matter because the answer is always the same. I don't care what you are. If you can look me in the eye, this is the way I said it to him, if you can look me in the eye and say to me that my hope for salvation, the forgiveness of my sins, my hope for eternal life, is based entirely on what Jesus did on the cross, and I bring no merit at all to the issue, no works, no performance, nothing. If I can say that I believe that exclusively what Jesus did on the cross is how my sins are forgiven and my hope of eternal life, if you can look me in the eye and say that, you're in. If you can't, you're not. That's just the way it is. Now, I might, and we talked a little bit after, I might think that your theology is goofy. Hey, my theology was goofy when I got saved, when I became a believer. Some people would say, your theology's still goofy, Mike. Okay? I get that. But that isn't the question. The question is not, can you articulate this point of doctrine to my satisfaction or to the satisfaction of somebody who wrote XYZ creed? That is not the question. The question is, upon what are you basing forgiveness of sins and eternal life? It has nothing to do with merit at all. And he looked at me and he said, I'm not completely sure, but I think I can say that. And at that point, I'm not going to look at the guy and say, well, you must be a liar because you're a Mormon. No, I'm going to look at the guy and think, I sure hope so, because that's the gospel. That's what you need to focus on. Maybe next year we can have some theological discussion, but this is the question today. And the question and the answer is going to be the same no matter who you are. I don't care what you are. Can you say this or not? Now, as far as the email, here's part of what I wrote back. Dear XYZ, the fact that you're not sure whether you'll lose your salvation over a divorce and remarriage makes me wonder if you understand the gospel. Salvation cannot be earned. It was extended to sinners, not to people in the process of cleaning up their act. Romans 5:8. Consequently, that which cannot be earned by moral perfection. Okay, salvation is not of works, and we're never going to be perfect, so it's totally out of reach. That which cannot be earned by moral perfection cannot be lost by moral imperfection. And to bring it down to the divorce, salvation wasn't earned by getting married, so it cannot be lost by getting divorced and remarried. And then I added a few things about his situation. But he wrote back and said, that was helpful. Now we can look at that and say, look, dude, you're in a church. How did you not know this? It's difficult. It's difficult to surrender any sense of merit. In part because we're sensitive, to sin. But you got to get over the hump that God looks at you based on something you do. This is not how your relationship started. Okay, Christ didn't die for you while you were in the process of cleaning up your life, while you were in the process of learning to articulate the hypostatic union and the depth of the incarnation. Okay, he ain't waiting around for that. He died for you while you were yet a sinner. That's it. Period. Exclamation point, really. That's what you need to grasp. And again, I know Christians who just struggle with this. No different than me, no different than anybody else who has sort of come to grips with what grace is. But that's what it is. It doesn't mean, now I can go out and sin all I want because God died for me while I was yet a sinner and he loves me. What did Paul say to that very question? God forbid. Okay, you're missing the point, dude. That's my paraphrase of what he says in Romans there. The gospel isn't here so that you can keep on sinning. The gospel is what it is so that you know it is not performance-based. You can be at your worst and Christ still died for you. That's what it's for. It's not to give you permission to do something weird. So again, I think this is something we really need to grasp.